Hello, my name is Norbert Meyn. Today is the 22nd of November 2019 and we're here at the Royal College of Music in London. This is my colleague Beth Snyder and we are both here to interview today Michael Graubart, or Michael Graubart as we would say in the German pronunciation, about the history of emigres, of migrant musicians, as we may call them, here, including yourself, of course, very much, here in London during and after the Second World War. So perhaps we could start, Michael. Could you tell us when and where you were born?
Yes, I was born in Vienna in 1930, 26th of November, so I should be 29 next week. I say 89 next week.
Could you tell us a bit about your parents, please? How did they meet?
Well, my mother was Russian, both Jewish, of that sort of culture. My mother grew up in Chita in Siberia, near Lake Baikal. My father was Austrian. His family came from further east, from Galicia, from the sort of eastern bit of the Austrian Empire. But my father was born in Innsbruck. He was in the Austrian army. He was an officer in the Austrian army in the First World War. He was wounded and taken prisoner on the Russian front and ended up in a camp in quite near Chita. And there, my grandfather, my mother's father, he was something of a leader of the Jewish community, I think. He used to entertain the Jewish officer prisoners, not the men, of course, just the officers, for the Jewish holidays. And my father never actually went, but after the 1917 revolution, by coincidence, the prisoners' camp was moved to Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean, and my mother's family moved to Vladivostok as well. And there my grandfather continued entertaining the Jewish prisoners. They were obviously given a fair amount of freedom because there was nowhere to escape to anyway. And there my father did meet my mother. My mother had been studying medicine in St. Petersburg, traveling on the Trans-Siberian Express at the beginning and end of the term and so on. I've always found it quite surprising. She came from a relatively Orthodox Jewish family, fairly conventional. How it was that they allowed a young girl to, travel halfway across Asia by herself, I've never quite understood, but they did. And then after 1918, Vladivostok kept changing hands. The Japanese took it, an expeditionary force, an American expeditionary force against the Bolsheviks took it for a while, and then a European expeditionary force. So my father in the end stowed away on a ship and managed to get back to Europe the other way round, having travelled eastwards from Austria to Vladivostok, then travelled further eastwards.
That's quite extraordinary. We're talking St. Petersburg, Vladivostok, and then going the other way around via the United States, right. I presume. Yeah, wow.
and my mother and her, my grandfather, I think my grandmother had died by then, but my grandfather and an uncle of mine, my mother's brother, went across the Pacific to America. But my mother and her two young sisters travelled overland all the way to Austria because she wanted to finish her medical studies in Vienna, and I suspect the fact that she'd met my father might have had something to do with it. And so she then went westwards to Austria, my father went eastwards back to Austria, and they met again in Vienna and eventually married.
And do you remember your childhood in Vienna? What do you remember of it?
I remember very little about it, actually. Yes, I mean, I can remember standing on the balcony of our flat in Vienna, seeing a Zeppelin coming up, through the sky. I can remember the ships, the paddle steamers on the Danube Canal, and I was fascinated by the fact that they kept their paddle wheels going to keep the ships alongside against the current, as it were. I can remember the travel agents in the centre of Vienna, because they had these lovely models of ships and aeroplanes in the windows. Always wanted to have them. But I don't remember very much else.
Were your parents working in Vienna when you were little, and what were they doing?
My father, my other grandfather, my paternal grandfather in Innsbruck, had started a shoe business and had become quite prominent. And my father for a while worked in the business, then moved to Vienna and started his own firm, also shoes. And in fact, by the time I came along, he owned a whole chain of shops all over Austria and half shares in a factory or something. And so that's what he did. My mother didn't work. She wasn't terribly well. She had asthma very badly, and you're going to ask me eventually about music making in the home. Apparently, when she was young, she used to sing a lot, but by the time I was there, her asthma was so bad that she didn't really sing. Well, actually, that's not quite true. She had two things she used to sing when she was doing the washing up. One was the Abschied from Das Lied von der Erde, and the other was her own rather extraordinary version, sounding like a sad Russian folk song, of the sailor's song from the beginning of Tristan. Du irisch Kind.
Was there other music making in your home besides your mother's?
My father played the piano, not very well because he was very busy in business and so on. Yes, he played. I can remember him playing Beethoven sonatas, or playing them rather slowly.
Fair enough.
Apparently, I used to sit with my mother and listen, and every time he played a wrong note, I'd shout out "Falsch!"
Right. So you already had the musical gene then.
I think so, yes.
So did you any idea where it came from? I mean, from your parents partly, but also were there other influences?
Well, one of my uncles on my father's side, half-brother, my father's half-brother, who was incidentally murdered in the Kristallnacht, eventually murdered by his old ski instructor and a couple of his mountaineering companions, murdered in front of his wife and his 4-year-old daughter.
It's terrible.
Well, he was very musical. He was a very good violinist. An amateur. He went into his father's business. He actually studied engineering, but went into the business. But I believe he did occasionally play as an extra with the Tyrol Symphony Orchestra. But I don't think there was any particular music other than, that's a bit indirect. My father's half-brother. Yeah.
So your family was also still in Vienna when the Anschluss happened. Yes. And could you tell us a bit about what that meant for your family at that time, and then how your family managed to get out and get to Britain eventually?
Yeah, I ought to know more than I actually do about all this, but we were Jewish, obviously, and it was quite clear that we would end up in a concentration camp if we didn't manage to get out. In fact, the first thing that happened, it was actually still just before the Anschluss, I think. I'm not quite sure about that. A man who'd been a sort of office boy in my father's firm, and who was then in the SS, telephoned late at night at a considerable risk to his own life, and said to my father on the phone, "I've just been sent to get you. Get out." And my father packed a bag and disappeared, and went into hiding. He actually managed to hide for a while as a patient in a hospital in the outskirts of Vienna that had been reserved for top-ranking SS officers and people like that.
Gosh.
He happened to know one of the doctors, so he managed to get in there. And then somehow or other, he managed to get some forged papers. I've never got to the bottom of all this, but we had some kind of, as I say, forged documents which allowed us to get out. My mother's two sisters, my two aunts, who'd come with her to Austria and who were living in Vienna, they got out because there was a brief period when the authorities were letting people with Czech passports out, and the Jewish ecclesiastical authorities were playing ball. So my father found two Czech Jews who would marry my aunts, and the rabbis divorced them again 6 weeks later, but they had Czech passports, so they got out with us. Much easier for them than it was for us, but somehow we did get out.
Do you know how your family managed to actually travel to Britain?
Yes, we went by train to Switzerland, to Zurich. We had some, they were either friends of my father's or some kind of very distant relatives, so we stayed with them for a short time, and then my father went on to London to try and find somewhere to live and something to do. We were let out with 2 Austrian shillings each. I don't know if I can tell you about a crisis there, that you can edit all these things out, but my mother's family, for some reason, had the gambling instinct, and one of my aunts had it particularly badly, and my father had a sort of suspicion about this, and just before we left he insisted on looking into her suitcase. We were out, as I say, with immediate belongings and 2 Austrian shillings each. There was a stack of banknotes in her suitcase, so my father took them all out and left them.
Because if they had been found, then
we would have been for it. When the train approached the Swiss border, my father suddenly had a kind of hunch and insisted on looking in her suitcase again, and they were all back in the suitcase. And he dropped them note by note out of the window on one side of the train when the German or Austrian officials, military ones, you know, were coming down the corridor on the other side of the train. Anyway, he just managed to get them all out of the
unbelievable. How old were you then exactly?
I was not quite 8.
Yeah, and do you still remember that train? I mean, sort of.
What I remember, typically, I suppose, of a child, is that when we stopped on the Swiss side of the border, my parents, of course, were incredibly relieved. We'd got away, we were out. And there was a cafe actually on the platform of the station there, and outside the platform there was a tank with trout in it. And while we were there, a waiter came out in waiter's uniform, came out with a little net and caught a trout and took it into the restaurant to cook for somebody, you know.
Yeah.
Now, I remember that. I don't remember really very much else of the journey. And then we went by train and ship to Dover, and then I think it was Dover, must have been Dover, and then to London. And by then my father had found a small, well, a single room really for my 2 aunts had found something somewhere else in London, I think. My parents and I lived in this one room for a while, and while my father was trying to find something to do to earn some money. You know.
Yes. Yeah. And how did that go? I mean,
well,
how did you find something?
My father had, when he was in the shoe business back in Austria, he'd got to know an English businessman who became quite a friend, and I think he helped us for a while, and whether he actually gave us money or just helped us, you know, I really don't know what the details were, but he certainly helped us. Later on, of course, he also helped when people like my father were interned in the Isle of Man, and he escaped that because this man, Mr. Hartridge, sort of vouched for his character and so on. And the other one who vouched for my father was Viscount Lord Samuel, whom my father got to know because my father had been very active in Zionist politics before the war. So he got to know Samuel that way.
So there were some existing connections with people in Britain beforehand.
Yes.
Yes, and
Yeah.
that was very useful,
That's
of
right.
course.
And my father spoke English, not terribly well, but he did speak English. My mother didn't. My mother hated England, hated the weather, hated the food, hated the language.
So, and did your father then find a proper career in Britain after that?
He set up a sort of import and export business, and sold baby pants to Marks and Spencer's and stuff like that. I remember on one occasion he got exported a consignment of tractors to somewhere, South America or something. Showed me a picture of one of these tractors and wanted to know which was the front of it. He knew nothing about it. You know, he exported earthworms to somewhere in South America because they're good for the soil, you know.
Yeah. And your mother, did she?
My mother never worked.
Yes. So she. And did you find your family find a home in London where you then lived permanently, or did you have to move a lot?
We moved out to St Albans, just 20 miles north of London. The idea was to live out there because of the Blitz.
Yes.
In fact, my parents finally moved back to London just before the Blitz began. So that was rather bad timing, but I continued living in St Albans. My two aunts moved to St Albans as well, so I lived with them. When I was in the 5th and 6th form at school, I was living with them.
So how did your education then continue? So you went to school, I presume, during the war in London?
I went to school, a rather strange primary school in London for a short time, and then my father had this idea of evacuation, so my two aunts and I were shunted off to Bournemouth, and I went to school in another rather strange, peculiar primary school in Bournemouth. And then, as I say, we moved back to London just when the Blitz was about to start, and then we moved out to St Albans. I got the order slightly wrong. So my father carried on working in London, had this small export-import business, and my mother and I lived in St Albans, and my father used to come home in the evening. And my two aunts lived in St Albans. They had a flat somewhere else. And then when my parents finally moved back to London permanently, I stayed with my aunts because I didn't want to change. That was just before I took what used to be called high school certificate, equivalent of A-level. And so I didn't want to change school at that point, so I stayed with my aunts. Used to come up to London for weekends.
And what about musical education then? Did you start playing instrument, or what happened with your musical education?
I mean, my parents were very musical. They went all the time to the Vienna Philharmonic concerts back in Vienna, you know, and the Staatsoper and so on. As I said, my father played Beethoven on the piano, so I had music going on, as it were. Once we left Austria, we never had a piano. We couldn't afford it, and we weren't in places where we could install a piano and so on. So I never learned to play the piano. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the piano is something I try the odd chord on when I'm composing. But I took up the flute, oddly enough, through my physics teacher at school, because he showed us how to make bamboo pipes out of old Victorian curtain rails. And I made myself a bamboo pipe, and then I made myself a bamboo cross flute. And then I got dissatisfied with both of them, and my parents bought me a recorder, and then my parents bought me a flute. And I was entirely self-taught. I must have been quite a good self-teacher, because by the time I got to university, I became the first flute of the university orchestra straight away as soon as I got to university. And a couple of years later, played the Fifth Brandenburg with the university orchestra with the reader in music as the pianist, harpsichordist pianist, and the professor of violin at the old Manchester College of Music as the violin soloist. So, you know, I must have been tolerably good, but I was entirely self-taught. And I read a lot of books. When I was still at school, I was known as being musical, even though I was studying physics, maths and physics and so on. We used to do a Shakespeare play every Christmas at school. People used to
now,
come.
which school is that now again?
It was St Albans County Grammar School for Boys.
So you went to grammar school in St Albans then? Yes,
that's right. There were two. There was a sort of minor public school, and then there was the grammar school. Now I went to the grammar school. They used to have records for the music for the plays. Now I went along to the teacher who directed the plays and said, what about live music? And he wanted to have music that was contemporary with Shakespeare. So I found him some bits out of the Fitzwilliam Virginal book or something like that. And he didn't like it. So I decided I'd cheat. And I found an old volume of Purcell keyboard suites, showed him those, or played him one or two of them, and he liked those, so he accepted that. You know, I didn't tell him that he was a half a century later, you know. So I organised it. I found some other boys in the school, and we formed a little ensemble and rehearsed it. So that was the beginning of my kind of organising music and, well, not conducting, obviously.
Yes.
There was just myself on flute and a pianist and a violinist and a recorder player. Yeah, so I was entirely self-taught, really, until after I'd graduated. I graduated in physics, having spent most of my time playing the flute and used to play chamber.
Well, yes, I mean, that physics teacher must have had quite a strong influence on you. You had both the flute and the subject, I suppose, that you took up at university. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, when I was at school, there was no doubt in my mind that what I wanted to do was pure research in physics. Of course, I didn't get a research grant because I'd spent most of my time playing the flute, and beginning to compose and so on. So I didn't. I got a degree. It wasn't a very good degree, but I got a degree. And,
good. While you were growing up here, did your home feel like an English home, or did it feel Austrian?
No. We always spoke German at home, and I'm very glad we did, because it meant that I learned good English at school instead of bad English from my parents. And I kept my German up to some extent. I mean, I still speak, it's pretty rusty, but I still speak German. But it was very much, I wouldn't say necessarily that it was an specifically Austrian, but it was certainly European and not English. Wasn't Orthodox Jewish, but it was Jewish, and we did have the Passover meals and so on once a year and that kind of thing. I mean, for my father, Passover was a political matter. It was freedom for the Jews, you know, and so on. But my mother was a bit more Orthodox than that. But so it felt very much as a kind of mixture of Jewish and Austrian, or Jewish and European, perhaps I should say.
Mm. So then, from when you finished your at grammar school, did you go straight to university in
Yes.
Manchester? And so tell us about that. So, studying physics, playing the flute all the time, and I was wondering particularly if you were in touch with any other emigres from Austria or from Germany at the time, or were you basically surrounded mostly by British students there?
Oh, at university it was almost all British. This was, I mean, I went up in 49. It was only just after the war. At school before that in St. Albans, there were two other refugee boys, one from, I suppose they were both from Germany actually. One of them eventually went back to Germany and became a repetiteur, I think head of music staff actually at Bielefeld Opera. The other one became quite well known as a philosopher, interestingly. He was a year older than me, so I kind of knew him, but I wasn't friends with him. He worked at the LSE, Ernest Gellner. When I got to Manchester, very surprisingly, because there's a big Jewish population, Ashkenazi Jews in North Manchester, Sephardic Jews in South Manchester. Yeah. I was in digs with an old Sephardic Jewish lady who couldn't quite believe that I was Jewish at all, really. So there was a lot of Jewish population, but to my surprise, I don't think I met a single person from Germany or Austria. It might be worth saying this is the wrong order to say things, but when I was still at school, when I was still quite little, when I was in the first, second, third year, I was bullied by some of the other boys, not because I was Jewish, but because I was German. I was the enemy, you know. The de Havilland's aircraft firm was just down the road from the school, you know, so we were bombed all the time by Germans.
Yes.
So
I know, I mean, that is in itself, I mean, it's such a complex situation, isn't it? But people just didn't really, until later on, it became clear what had happened to the Jews, and, you know, the full extent of the Holocaust became wide knowledge. Until then, people weren't really that clear about who, you know, who was against the German, who was German and not a Nazi, or, you know, and then the story on the Isle of Man, you know, you've said your father was interned there.
He actually wasn't interned.
Oh no, sorry, yes, but many, yes, I apologize, but many others who were, were, you know, refugees and Nazis who had been caught up in Britain at the beginning of the war, were interned together, and again, there was no or not enough sensitivity towards that differentiation. So yeah, very, very interesting. So and then as a student, well, you did take on physics. You must have taken it seriously to a certain extent.
Oh yeah, I mean, when I went up to university, I was very committed to being a research physicist.
But then you played flute all the time, so you got there was a competing part of you. Right. And tell us a bit more about the musical life in the university in that period.
There wasn't, I mean, apart from the university orchestra, which was a full symphony orchestra, and apart from that, there wasn't really very much. I mean, I managed to get together with, I met another physics student who was rather a good violinist, and then there were a couple of people from the Halle Orchestra that somehow we got to know, a viola player and a cellist, so I played with them. But it was arranged by ourselves, you know, we just agreed to meet and play some Mozart flute quartets and things. And the university orchestra would rehearse for most of the term, and then just before the concert, all the principal wind would get little notes saying that they were needed for the concert, and the equivalent members of the BBC Northern would appear in their place for the concert, because the head of there wasn't a professor of music then. This was before Redlich went to Manchester. The head of the music department was called Proctor Gregg, Humphrey Proctor Gregg, who'd worked with Bruno Walter on opera before the war and all sorts of things. Believed that music more or less finished before Debussy was born. Debussy was too modern for our ears, you know. And he conducted the college, the University Orchestra, and he would sack. You know, he wanted to give a good impression at the concert, so all the principal wind players got the sack just before the concert. I must say, I'm sorry, I'm boasting. I was the only one who didn't. So I found myself playing with the principal bassoon and the principal oboe and the principal clarinet of the BBC Northern Orchestra. Yes, I suppose it was called the BBC Northern Orchestra then.
Wow. So then, at the end of your university time, you did actually take up a job in in engineering with EMI.
Yes.
And then, so where did you do that? And then you, in parallel, of course, you started studying music more seriously.
Yes, so I started having serious flute lessons, and I was very lucky. I played to Geoffrey Gilbert, and he agreed to take me on. You know, he was a marvelous teacher. And then a little bit later on, Mátyás Seiber for composition. I had some conducting lessons from Lawrence Leonard very much later. That was when I was Director of Music of Morley, and I started a conducting class, invited Lawrence to be the tutor, and then enrolled for my own class, because I wanted to have some lessons.
But there must have been a sort of watershed moment when you were pursuing a career in physics and with engineering, and was that presumably in London again?
Yes.
Yes. So you came back to London, and then you had these lessons here, where you must have felt that I now actually want to pursue my professional future as a musician. Was that a very gradual process, or was there a sort of, did you wake up one morning feeling, no, I now want to be a musician?
No, it was gradual. I was still working at EMI, and I started getting the odd freelance job, you know, playing for amateur opera companies in the orchestra and that sort of thing. And somehow it gradually shifted over. And then there was a time actually before I worked at EMI. No, I'm telling you a lie. After I left EMI, I got interested in teaching, and I taught one night a week on an American air base out in the Cotswolds. Had to hitchhike back home in the evening because the trains finished very early in those days. And I got more and more interested in teaching. At some point, and I must say my memory is very vague and confused, at some point I decided I'd see if I could get a teaching job in adult education, overlapping with working at, again I'm telling you a lie, I gave up the EMI, went into teaching, and I eventually taught in a grammar school in London. And I taught maths and physics.
Maths and physics, as you had studied. Yeah.
Yes, and I also taught at the Old Regent Street Polytechnic, teaching maths, and at other technical colleges in Ealing and out in East London, part-time, you know. And during that period, as I say, I began occasionally to get a playing job, and then I decided I would try and get a teaching job in music. And actually, I through Katharina Volpe, whom I'd met casually, you know, met her at concerts and things. And she was teaching at Morley. She was teaching advanced piano class at Morley. And her subsequent husband, Lawrence Leonard, was conducting the symphony orchestra at Morley College. I got a job at Morley.
And that was sort of around what time?
66, I think. Yes, So I had one class which was a kind of mixture of music history. It's worth stressing that Morley College is an adult education college, and so especially at that time it's changed quite a lot since then. But at that time, almost all the students were actually doing it for pleasure, not because they were studying for career. You know, so they were either coming to classes in history of music or singing in the choir or playing in the orchestra as amateurs. So I taught an elementary, a class that was sort of a mixture of elementary theory and a bit of history. And then every time a tutor of something in the music department left, I seemed to end up teaching that class as well.
Yes.
So gradually I ended up teaching, half a dozen or more different classes.
Yeah.
And then eventually John Gardner, who was the director of music in those days, decided to retire. And I can remember the principal, whom I later on became very good friends with, but he was really rather distinguished man, actually. And he called me into his office and said, I've got to appoint a new director of music, and I'm trying to decide whether to appoint another famous composer or somebody who will actually do the work. And I've decided on the latter. So I became director of music.
Wow.
And carried on teaching.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now that's of course there's a huge history of, you know, first of all emigres at Morley College, but just generally as Morley College is this really interesting hub of these kind of various transcultural connections, aren't they? Because I mean with Walter Goer being there, and also of course Seiber. Now I wanted to just go back a little bit with this, because you mentioned that you went into music, but it wasn't also it wasn't just one thing of music. It was three things, wasn't it? It was the flute, it was conducting, and it was composition.
Well, the composition was always my own private activity. I never taught composition. Even later on at the Royal Northern, I had one student who was doing composition as a second study. But I've never really wanted to teach composition because I think my tastes are not broad enough. You know, if somebody brought me a piece in the sort of Schoenbergian tradition, I think I would be able to say relatively intelligent things about it. If somebody brought me a piece in the Vaughan Williams tradition, I don't think I'd be able to say anything very helpful to him. So I've always avoided teaching composition.
Yeah. So you were, as a performer and as a conductor, you were a musician who was obviously you were experienced with orchestral matters from playing in orchestras. And then your interest in composition as a private activity, as you said, when did that start and how did that develop?
It started when I was still a student in Manchester. I can still remember when I was still at school before that, one morning hearing some Bartók quartets on the radio while I was having breakfast, thinking that it was an absolute insult to the ear to present that kind of noise, you know. I remember going into school and meeting a couple of other musical boys who'd had exactly the same reaction to the Bartók. It took me quite a while before I was at all interested in contemporary music, but when I was at Manchester, I think in my first year, I used to go to all the chamber music concerts, and there was one concert where they played a piece, a piano quartet or something by Walton, and it suddenly appealed to me, and that really hit me. And I went home and sketched out one or two things, you know, and in something like that sort of style. I didn't really understand the style, but so I actually began to, come to think of it, I wrote a flute sonata when I was still at school, in the style of Mozart, more or less. Not quite as good, but...
You were the music director of the Focus Opera Group?
From 1969.
Oh, 69, okay.
Yeah,
Could you
I
tell
was
us
a part-time tutor from 66
Yes.
And then from '69, I was the first full-time director of music Morley.
Ah, okay. Could you
And
tell us
all
a
my
bit
previous
about?
ones were sort of distinguished composers who did Morley
Right.
on the side, you know.
Yeah. What kind of music did you perform with the group?
Perform.
Well, or sorry, you didn't
So
perform.
just
but-
wondering if we're talking about the same thing. But
Oh, maybe we're not.
no, 'cause, I think Beth was asking about the Focus Opera Group.
Oh,
And that wasn't the activity. It wasn't a group at Morley College,
no,
wasn't it?
it
That
later
was,
on became a group at Morley because
yes.
it ran out of money, and so I managed to arrange that it would become a class at Morley, you know.
Ah,
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah, Focus, a man called Michael Sargent had started it several years before. The idea was to do unusual works, small ones because we didn't have a chorus or an orchestra, both modern and occasionally ancient. And we used young professional singers or music students from the colleges as the singers, and good amateurs with some music students and so on for the orchestra. Yeah, and then I took over from forgotten what the man's name was now, who was the conductor originally, and so we did quite a lot of first performances in Britain at any rate, and so on.
And was it with an orchestra, or was it with...
Yes,
Mhm.
we'd fix
Yeah.
up an orchestra of, as I say, sort of good quality amateurs and music students and so on.
And where did you perform?
Most of the time at a place called International Student House, which had a quite nice theatre. Then we also did some productions at some place off the Edgware Road. I've forgotten what it was. So we performed where we could find a theatre to perform in.
That's great. Good. And I mean, now talking about composition, I'm just wanting to talk about Mátyás Seiber, and because obviously he was a very important influence for you.
Yeah.
And but how did you come across him? And I think you mentioned the Society for the Promotion of New Music, where you. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, while I was still at Manchester, I wrote the first movement of a sonata for viola and piano. When I got to London, and I was doing more composing, I wrote 3 more movements, and I sent it to the SPNM. They agreed to put it on. Cecil Aronowitz played it. Was the viola player. Hubert Dawkes was the pianist. And in those days, there was always then a discussion after the concerts about the pieces that had just been played. And on that occasion, it was Benjamin Frankel was the chairman of the discussion. Various people had sort of said quite nice things about my piece, you know, and said, you know, promising youngster, but has no technique, has to learn his job, as it were, and so on. And until that time, I hadn't ever thought of wanting to learn composition, because I felt I didn't want to teach compose like my teacher. I wanted to be original, you know. But after that occasion, I thought, well, perhaps I should learn something. So I wrote to Frankel, and he wrote back and said, I don't teach beginners, but my friend Mátyás Seiber does. So I wrote to Seiber, wrote to him about how wonderful the reception of my sonata was. He wrote back to say, yes, he'd heard it, he'd been there, which was a bit embarrassing. Anyway, he agreed to teach me, and so then I used to go once a week out to Caterham, where he lived, and I'd have a lesson.
Obviously, you must have met him very well then, and known him very well. Can you tell us a bit about him? I mean, he was Hungarian, of course, but he also had an extraordinary life. You know, he'd been playing on a ship, I
He was
think,
a cellist in a ship's orchestra.
and then
yes.
picked up jazz, and then a few
He
years later,
wrote instruction books for
Yeah.
jazz beginners and so on.
and then he taught jazz at the Frankfurt Conservatoire in the 20s.
That's right.
And but he had also been working with Kodai in Hungary, and folk song collecting. Then we know about his scores in Britain. I mean, he was a really, very influential composer in many ways, and also things like Animal Farm, the animation film. He wrote film scores, but then also a lot of very, very ambitious classical composition for people like Peter Pears and Benjamin Britten, who played his music. And so
You sang one of these songs.
yeah, I recently did, and I just find the music is absolutely stunning,
Mm.
and it's extraordinary. And it's interesting that he was such a prolific composer, yet he was able to give his time to a relative beginner composition student as well. And
that's true.
So
I
what
mean,
was
he
his
had a lot of
situation in Britain?
He had a lot of private students,
Mhm.
but they were mostly ones who were going to be professional composers.
Mhm.
Stanley Glasser, who became head of music at Goldsmiths,
Mhm.
and all sorts of people were students of his.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I felt very flattered, that he agreed to take me.
Mhm.
I remember when I finally telephoned him and asked him how much he charged for lessons. Now, I was very poor, my parents didn't have 2 pennies to rub together.
Mhm.
I was still a student and so on. And he said, I charge £15 an hour for those that can afford it, and £5 an hour for those who can't, and I assume you can't.
So what was he like? Tell us about him. I mean, as a man, as a person, as a musician.
He was very modest, quite small. I remember on one occasion, I used to go out to Caterham for lessons, but there was one occasion when we'd got a lesson fixed, but he had to come to London he ran a choir, and he had to have a rehearsal. And so we arranged that he'd come to my parents' flat. I was still living with my parents. And my mother was all agog to meet this great composer and teacher and everything. And when he'd gone, she said very sadly, "Oh, he just looked like a little Jewish tailor." Well, he did. He was very, very modest and so on. But his approach to composition was very analytical. So we spent a lot of time analysing Haydn minuets and things. I had to compose Bach 2-part invention. Bach in inverted commas, 2-part inventions and so on. I wasn't very good at that. And he was very generous with his time. If say I had a lesson at 10 o'clock in the morning, I'd arrive at 10. We'd go on till 12, 12:30. Then his wife would rustle up some sandwiches and things, and we'd go on for a bit more in the afternoon if he hadn't got a rehearsal or a date of some kind. And we analysed all these things, and then of course we analysed pieces I'd written. And I can still remember, after all these 2-part inventions in style of Bach, I got so fed up with trying to write pastiche Bach that I wrote a couple of atonal 2-part inventions for flute and violin or something. And with fear and trepidation, I showed them to him at my next lesson. And he said, "Oh, thank goodness, I've been waiting for you to do this for ages." So that's, every time I brought a piece, we'd obviously analyse that and pick it apart.
Mm-hmm.
And he had this extraordinary gift, I think, that when every time I left his house, I felt that the piece that I'd just written was absolute rubbish. It had been torn to pieces, but my next piece was going to be first rate. He was tremendously critical and tremendously encouraging.
Mm. Wow. And what was his sort of standing in the in Britain? I mean, did you have a sense of how his music was received and how much of it was known at the time? Did you go to concerts where his music was performed?
Very little of his music was performed. His last string quartet, the Quartetto Lirico, was taken up by the Amadeus Quartet and was played quite a bit. I think that's probably probably his best piece, or one of his best pieces anyway. His cantata oratorio, I don't know quite how you describe it, Ulysses, was actually performed by the Morley College Choir originally, presumably with the Morley College Symphony Orchestra, I'm not sure. Peter Pears would have been the soloist and so on. But he wasn't performed very much. I think he was mainly known as a teacher, but he was very known as a teacher. I mean, all sorts of people. Hugh Wood was a pupil of his. You know, all sorts of people who became well known in their own right had been students of his.
And then he conducted a choir as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
In the recording of his other Joyce cantata, the portrait of the artist as a young man, he was short of basses in his little choir, so I was hauled in to sing bass. So I'm on the recording.
And would he? So how old was he about when he taught you? What sort of age was he?
50s, I suppose.
Yeah, and that was in the 60s, right?
Sorry?
That was in the 1960s.
That was in the later 50s
Later
and
50s, yeah.
earlier 60s, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And of course he was killed very tragically in South Africa.
Yes. So was that, did you know him until the end?
Yes.
Yeah. And then it was suddenly your teacher was gone.
That's
basically.
right. Now, I had stopped going. I mean, at first I went every week for a lesson.
Yes.
And then we tapered it off a bit, and I went whenever I'd written something, you know. So I wasn't seeing him every week then when he got killed, but I was still seeing him. It was very, very sad.
Of course. I mean, and was he? Do you think was he very much talking about previous? What I'm interested in is was he more interested in the sort of time before he had left, and was he referring back to that a lot, or was he actually very much a Brit by that time?
I think I was very conscious of the fact that he was Hungarian and that he'd studied with Kodály and that he knew Bartók, and by then I liked Bartók. On the other hand, he was very much part of the British musical scene because he'd written lots of film music, of course. He did get performances. He wasn't performed every day, you know, but I mean, he was getting performances. So he rather like me, I suppose, he was sort of hovering between two worlds, you know. I remember he was in hospital once with some stomach problem or something, and I remember going to see him, and he was sitting up in bed, looking incredibly, almost parodistically Jewish. At the foot of the bed, there was a placard saying Lutheran, and he was correcting the proofs of an early mass setting of his.
You've spoken a bit already about what your students were like at Morley, but I wonder if you could say something about what the community felt like more generally, your colleagues?
That's, I think, a very interesting question. There was a strong feeling that Morley was a special place, and people were mostly, I think, very kind of proud of being students there. But since we covered such a diversity of subjects, there wasn't that much getting together of students from different subjects, you know. I mean, there was a very big art department, My first wife, who's a professional artist, a printmaker, she studied printmaking at Morley. That's not where we met, but she studied printmaking there. My second wife studied singing there, big language department. In fact, my second wife, who had previously been married to a Frenchman, taught French and ran a family French class for people who wanted to take their kids abroad for holidays, that sort of thing. And so there were all these different things going on. And so there wasn't, I mean, I suppose the one time when a lot of people from the college would get together was the Christmas fair, and also people would contribute stuff to sell, but they would serve on the counter selling stuff and so on. It was really more within departments, you know. I mean, the music department was really a unit on its own in a way.
And that sort of feeling of specialness, I mean, because obviously which elements of Morley College's history contributed to this pride that people felt of being part of that?
I think probably two things. One was the history of previous directors of music, I have to say, as you know, and they were, unlike me, because I was the first full-time one, were just really distinguished, well-known musicians, composers, Holst to start with, you know, and Michael Tippett and so on. Adult education institutes didn't normally have people like that as heads of department. I think that was the one side. And the other side was that we did put on lots of public performances. In those days, we had a symphony orchestra that, for the most part, didn't give public performances. It was really a reading orchestra. It was actually Lawrence Leonard who started the symphony orchestra some years before I first went there, because at that time, the instrumentalists at the music colleges in London, this place and the Academy and Guildhall and so on, they treated their orchestras like amateur orchestras. They would rehearse a whole term and then give a concert. And Lawrence felt that the students really needed to have played all the Beethoven symphonies and so on by the time they tried to get into the profession. So he started the symphony orchestra as a reading orchestra. Each week they'd read through a major work. I mean, I conducted it once or twice. I conducted Mahler's 7th Symphony with them. But the chamber orchestra did give concerts, and I persuaded them sometimes to play for the choir, which I conducted. You know, I actually conducted 3 choirs. But at least 2 of those choirs gave public concerts. We had a link with Southwark Cathedral, so we did concerts there. There was an opera group which tended to go for relatively unknown operas. So again, people came to that, and so that was the other leg, if you like, that made Morley well known in the
really special,
community.
yes. And then what about the history of the association with emigres in particular? Because there were a lot of them, of course. Yes. Was that and then when you were appointed, there was another one right at the helm of the music department. So were you very aware of that special kind of Austro-German contingent on the faculty?
I was once I got there, yes, indeed, because I mean I knew Ilse Wolf, Katharina Volpe had got me the job there, or helped to get me the job there in the first place, you know. Who else did I know at that time? Alexander Goer I knew. I never met Walter Goer. But I mean, he of course put Morley quite a lot on the map by giving those early performances of Monteverdi, the Vespers and well, particularly the Vespers. I actually did a performance of Orfeo at the LSE, because for a while I conducted the student orchestra at the LSE.
The London School of Economics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we did, I re-edited Orfeo from a photocopy of the 1607 manuscript.
Yes.
And it wasn't very authentic. We had to use clarinets instead of cornetti. but so in a way I was doing something similar.
That's right. So there was an interest in early music in Morley as well.
Yes.
Wow. And so, and then what about, well, Tippett? I mean, there was. I mean, I was thinking of Alfred Deller, who was also, of course, at that, was an early pioneer of this early music. Was he was involved as well?
I think he may have given taught a few classes, the odd class or something. I don't think he was ever kind of regularly on the staff, as far as I know.
What about Walter Bergmann? Was he involved?
Walter Bergmann taught recorder.
Yes.
And obviously was and he worked with Tippett, of course, because Tippett had made arrangements of Purcell songs and so on, piano parts, and some had recorder obbligati and so on. So they worked together. And yes, so there was quite a. We had a when I first went, I wasn't really very conscious of what else was going on. I was still a physics and maths teacher elsewhere, and I just taught one class, But once I got involved and became director of music, of course, I knew what was going on. And we had a lot of early music going on. We had a kind of medieval wind group. The choirs sometimes did early polyphonic music and so on. I remember doing Dufay with the Morley College choir, who were non-auditioned, and we asked them if they could read notation. We didn't test them. Doing Dufay was quite strange, really. I mean, when I was very keen to do as wide a range of music, both in the groups that I conducted myself and the department as a whole. So we did quite a lot of early music, we did quite a lot of modern music. We didn't do all that much 19th century music because, first of all, most of the music was well enough known anyway, but also we didn't have big enough groups, I mean, I've conducted a fair amount of opera, but I've never conducted Verdi, or because I've never worked with an ensemble that had that sized orchestra and chorus and so on.
Wow. Now, what about Katharina Volpe? Because she got you involved there. Could you tell us a bit more about her?
Well, yes. I mean, I got to know her very well because, I mean, the funny thing was that I originally met her just casually at a concert at the Wigmore or somewhere. It was quite a while before we discovered we lived next door to each other. And we became very friendly, and she tried to give me piano lessons. She gave up after a bit, I think. But I realized quite early on that she was really quite an outstanding teacher. She was a great musician. She suffered from terrible nerves, and especially after her marriage to Lawrence Leonard broke up, she would regularly break down in the middle of a concert and that sort of thing. I used to go to these concerts, just praying that she'd get through the program. But she was a wonderful performer of particularly Schubert, and on the other hand, Schoenberg and Bergen-Weben. She played her own, her father's music.
Stefan Volpe.
Stefan, whom I got to know a bit through her, because he lived and worked in New York.
In New York, yes.
He came over occasionally, and I met him. He very sadly had contracted Parkinson's disease, and the last time I saw him, he was well, very, very ill with that indeed.
Yeah.
But he was a tremendous character.
Yes, but they both. I mean, obviously that Volpe's history. I mean, I think of him, around sort of, Eisler comes to mind. That sort of really, but also as a pupil of Schönberg. Yes, and so there's that whole legacy for her in the family. What was it? I mean, what did the fact that you both had a background in the German-speaking world, so to speak, did that play a big part in your relationship? And what was the sort of sense of, you must have, you found yourself in this completely new environment. I mean, by that
which
time,
environment? You mean
well, London now. I mean, Britain. I mean, and
Yeah.
of course, but that's you grew up here as well. But I mean, was it so? How much of your relationship was defined by your common background?
I think mainly because we shared an interest in the same kinds of music.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Schubert is probably. I remember Seiber saying to me once, we'd been talking about various things other than my compositions, and he said, I think if Schubert had lived 2 years longer, he would have been the greatest of them all. Well, I must say, Kati, I think, felt that quite independently. I think I felt that quite independently too, So that was a link. And of course, she played Bach and Haydn and Beethoven and so on, who are all people who are very important to me. But I mean, that's not special in a way, because I suppose I would have had the same kind of relationship with any pianist who played that kind of repertoire. I think it's the fact that it was particularly Schoenberg and Berg, whom I was very interested in, and she played a lot of that. That was a special link, because other people, there weren't many pianists who played all the Beethoven, all the Schoenberg piano pieces and so on. Then I suppose the fact that we lived next door to each other meant that we saw quite a bit of each other once we realized that we...
Did you speak English to her or German?
English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she was more fluent in German than I was.
Mm-hmm.
I must tell you one thing about my relationship with Katharina.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been in the early 60s. I think I should have looked up some dates. But I decided I wanted to put on a concert in London of contemporary music.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd got to know a singer called Josephine Nendick, who sang quite a lot of contemporary music, and I wrote some songs for her, which she broadcast once, and so on. And we decided that we would put on a concert. We'd fix up an ad hoc small orchestra. We saved up some money and paid them, we got some really good players from the LSO and the LPO and so on, and made this chamber orchestra. And we did this concert. I conducted. Josephine was one of the soloists, and Katharina played in one of the ensemble pieces, the Webern Concerto for 9 instruments, but also played some solo Schoenberg pieces. And my parents, obviously they came to the concert, little Michael conducting a concert. When we were still in Vienna before the war, I went for a time to a kindergarten. I would have been 5 or 6, and I went to a kindergarten run by a lady called Hedi Schwarz, and she was after the Anschluss, she was a refugee, came to London, and my parents had somehow kept up with her. So when I put on this concert with Josephine Nendick, my parents invited her, to see what her little kindergarten child was up to. And I'd forgotten her. My God, I was in my 20s, and this was when I was 5 or 6. I was introduced to her by my parents after the concert, and she said, "How wonderful it is to have two of my little pupils in the same concert." And I said, "Two?" And apparently Katharina Volpe was in the same kindergarten back in Vienna.
Oh, wow.
I think, I don't know how much we overlapped, because Kathi was actually 2 or 3 years younger than me, but yes, I've lost the track of your question.
No, that was, thank you so much for that. It's so special, isn't it? Life is crazy like that sometimes. The Ilse Wolf was the other one. She was obviously a singing teacher at Morley College. She also taught here at the Royal College of Music, actually.
Did you? I
I
didn't
think.
know that.
But I also spoke with Janet Baker about Ilse Wolf, and of course they were both taught by Helene Isep.
Yeah.
And so just could you share some memories of her and in the context of Morley, but also in general?
Well, I had all sorts of connections with Ilse, oddly enough, because one of the pianists that later on played for her class at Morley was actually a student at the LSE when I conducted the student orchestra there, and I'd done a Beethoven concerto with him, with the student orchestra and him as soloist. So that was another connection. But basically, I met her as a result of being at Morley College. And then we had other connections later, because, as I say, my wife, my second wife, was a student of hers. I used to go to her Christmas parties out in West London somewhere, where one met all sorts of interesting people. But yes, I mean, that was as far as it went out.
Do you remember hearing her sing?
Oh, yes.
Yes. What was she like as a singer?
I loved her singing, as long as she stuck to music that she was good at, you know, which was obviously Schubert, Brahms, Wolf, Schumann, and Bach. I think she was a lovely singer.
And do you know something about her story? I mean, her background?
I don't actually, no. I never really knew her sort of intimately as a friend. We were quite close as colleagues, but not really more than that.
And it's always, I mean, I just wonder sometimes how much you would have meant to other emigres spoken about the experience of this change, and how much, you know, of the whole trauma of the war. But I suppose everybody had some war memories, and you know, it wasn't only the emigres that,
No, of course.
you know. But you know, would that have been something that would have come up in conversations?
I can't remember ever talking to Ilse about experiences during the war or anything like that, but it obviously was there because we did have an affinity. We both spoke German. We both loved the same music. It was very clear that she came from the same cultural background that I came from, and that just reminds me, I mean, jumping back to a very much earlier part of this conversation, you asked me about whether, what kind of home I had in Vienna. Now, I think Ilse Wolf came from a rather socially, as it were, kind of lower kind of background. My home in Vienna was a very much a very cultured, typically middle-class Jewish household. The walls were covered with bookcases. We had records almost entirely of classical, quote, classical music, and so on. You know, my parents, as I say, went to the opera and to the symphony concerts regularly and the chamber concerts. I have one other memory which kind of links with that. When I was at school in St. Albans, there were occasional chamber concerts in the town hall in St Albans, and one year the Rosé Quartet came.
Yes.
Oh,
With Buxbaum as the cellist, you know, the famous Buxbaum, and I think that there was some distant connection with somebody that my father knew, who knew Buxbaum. I think so. There was, I went to that concert anyway.
Well, Arnold Rosé was from the Vienna Philharmonic,
yes.
right? He was he the first violinist?
He was the leader.
Yes, and
Buxbaum was the principal cellist.
And Alma Rosé was his daughter, right? Who then led the women's orchestra at Auschwitz. I think there was.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yes.
I'd forgotten
There's
that.
an incredible connection.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and they came. No, I think the Rosé Quartet was very much connected with the Anglo-Austrian Music Society.
Yes.
At the time. Did you ever have any, were you aware of the Anglo-Austrian Music Society?
Not really, no. I mean, I was too young still then, you know, I was still a schoolboy, and I hadn't really begun my musical life, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I knew there was such a thing as the Austrian Music Society, but I didn't know anything about it.
So how did your time at Morley influence your teaching in Manchester? Or did it?
I'm sure it must have done. I mean, the sheer extent of different musics that I'd been involved in and different musicians must have coloured my teaching in Manchester. And I mean, Manchester, it was quite strange in a way, because in one sense it was coming back to an earlier part of my life, because I'd been a student there,
right.
Physics student, and making music, but as an amateur. I suppose, you know, all the things I'd learned either from studying with Seiber, but also from teaching at Morley and just learning. I think teaching is the best way of learning anything.
Yes, you teach what you most need to learn. That's very good.
Exactly. So all that obviously affected my teaching. I tried to teach the kind of rather analytical approach to music that I'd acquired from studying with Seiber. Particularly, I mean, I remember doing a course on Bach cantatas and analysing them in quite detailed way with the students and so on. Tried to get them interested in Schoenberg, Bergenweben too, of course, and so on. There wasn't that much of a tradition of that kind of school in Manchester when I was there.
And so, how did you get the job up there, and what was the job exactly?
I got the job because in 1991 there was an upheaval at Morley College. A new principal had been appointed. There'd been a bit background of difficulty with a vice principal earlier, and I won't go into that, it was much too complicated, but the new principal had been appointed in rather a hurry in the middle of the academic year because the previous one had left. And we very quickly, when I say we, the full-time staff, it's worth remembering that Morley College had a huge student population, but they all came once a week for a part-time class. Same with the tutors. We had a huge number of tutors, but they all just taught one class and so on. So the actual full-time academic staff at Morley consisted of 8 people. I think it was 8 or 9, 8 I think, heads of department. We 8 very quickly realised that this principal was absolutely no good, quite the wrong person for Morley College. Thoroughly, well, at any rate, we took against her. And then there was, we mounted a great rebellion, and this went on for about a year and a half, maybe even 2 years. We finally got her sacked, or at least we got her given a golden handshake. And then the local authority decided, by then Morley was no longer entirely independent, it was run by the ILEA and so on. The authority decided that we had become such a unified staff group, so powerful, that no new principal could possibly manage us. And so they sacked a lot of us. We were made redundant in the phrase. And at that, everything happened in the same year in '91. My first wife left me. I'd lost my job. I'd started a new relationship with the lady that became my second wife eventually. I had to have somewhere to live. I had to have some money to live on. So I tried to get another job. And I think I filled in something like 20 application forms. You know, when you're 61, with lots of brilliant young kids coming out of music colleges, trying to get jobs, I didn't stand a chance, you know. And then by pure coincidence, I ran into the then principal of the Royal Northern, whom I sort of distantly knew through the SPNM or something like that, I forget. And we decided to have a drink together after the concert. And he said to me, "Do you happen to know anybody who wants a job for a year while one of our lecturers is on a sabbatical?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do know somebody." So that's how I got the job at the Royal Northern, having filled in 20-odd application forms in vain. Very unfair, but that's how I got the job there. And then they decided they quite liked me, so somehow the job got extended year after year and year. So I was there for 5 years in the end.
Yeah.
So you're also director of Akanthos, right?
I'm sorry?
You were also director of Akanthos?
Yeah, Akanthos was, it then became the new ensemble or something, which is rather boring, but in my day it had previously been run by Tony Gilbert, who'd also had lots of Morley connections. He taught there and studied there actually, and so on. And I knew Tony quite well, and he sort of passed it on to me. So I ran the Akanthos, the contemporary music ensemble.
Did you have a particular vision for the ensemble?
I very much asked them what they wanted to play. And we'd discuss it, you know, and I mean, it wasn't a stable ensemble, obviously, because in the way of contemporary music, no two pieces are scored for the same instruments, you know, but yes, I mean, we'd throw it around, you know, and discuss it and decide on programs and so on. It was great fun. I enjoyed it. I mostly conducted them, but not always. Sometimes postgraduate students who were doing conducting would conduct them.
Okay, yeah. What kind of music did you end up performing?
Oh, well, I remember we did, what's the Stockhausen piece for wind quintet? Not the ordinary wind quintet, but 5 wind instruments.
Okay, yeah.
I can't think what it was called. We did that one year. A lot of work we did on that.
Yeah.
We did a piece of mine actually. I actually did a piece with the big wind group at the college once as well. Yes, also very, very eclectic.
Good. Yeah.
So let's talk about your pieces then, your music. I mean, so what is there? Can you just give us an overview of your oeuvre, so to speak?
It isn't really all that big because, you know, I spent a great deal of my earlier life changing from being a maths and physics teacher to being a music teacher, and I had a lot to learn, a lot to read, a lot to listen to, and so on, as well as actually doing music, making, you know, conducting and so on. So it's actually very limited. There's a cantata setting of Georg Trakl, whom I came across. But I mean, I love poetry, but I've met quite a few poets through, I don't mean personally, I mean the work of quite a few poets through having met them through composers, you know. So I met Truckville through Webern and so on. There's a string quartet, there's a flute quartet, there's a viola sonata, there's a chamber concerto for viola, which was broadcast in Canada once. Lawrence Leonard, after he left Morley, he became the conductor of the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra in Canada, and he did, with the principal viola of the orchestra, did that. Very little piano music. I'm no good at piano music at all. I wrote one piece for Katharina Volpe. She commissioned it when she was in Canada, when she was living with Lawrence. And one piece commissioned by Catherine Starrock. Do you know?
Yes, a colleague here, yes.
Yeah, of course she teaches here.
Yes, yes, at the Royal College. Yeah.
No, she's a great friend of mine, and she was teaching at Morley, of course. She, like Paul Webster, accompanied one of my choirs at Morley. We had very distinguished accompanists, you know. And she commissioned a piece through the old GLAA or something. They got a commission fee. So there's only there's a third piano piece that seems to have got buried somehow. I think I've still got this manuscript somewhere, but what else? A few songs, not many. Couple of orchestral pieces, one written for a youth orchestra, for the Norfolk Youth Orchestra, because Lawrence Leonard conducted that one time, and he got me a commission to write the piece for the Norfolk. Was it Norfolk? I think. Long time ago. The other orchestral piece I wrote for the Morley College Symphony Orchestra and conducted it with them. That's about it.
And how do you feel your music has been received, and how has it been taken up in Britain? And has your sort of Austrianness had any bearing on that? Was it you know that?
I don't think so. No. The two piano pieces, the one I wrote for Katharina Volpe and the one I wrote for Catherine Starrock, especially the Starrock one, has been played by a few pianists a few times, but they all want to move on and do first performances because the critics come, you know. I think actually, when pieces of mine have been performed, people have, even critics sometimes, have liked them, but they hadn't sort of caught on, you know. I mean, out of the blue, I'd really stopped composing a good many years ago. I just felt I was repeating myself and so on. Out of the blue, I got a commission to write a piece for the BBC Singers last year through Basker. You know, it's now called the Ivors Academy, which I hate, but it was, you know, Basker, British Academy of Composers and Songwriters. They do a joint concert with the BBC Singers every year with a particular theme. And last year it was the refugee experience. So the two commissioned works for the concert were by a young Syrian composer and by me, by an old Austrian composer. So I actually managed to, you know, as I say, I hadn't written anything for several years. I wrote a short piece and they sang it. But very practically, I mean, my string quartet actually has been done. The Arditi Quartet did it and broadcast it about 8 or 10 years ago. I've sent it around to lots of other quartets. Nobody else wants to do it. But it was done in Vienna. I went to Vienna to speak at a conference about Holocaust education through the arts. And I was going to be introduced as a composer. So I said, well, if you're going to introduce me as a composer, you better bloody well play a piece.
When was that conference?
Oh, about 5-6 years ago. I forget the exact year. And then, of course, I think I sent you the link for. There's this organization based on the University for Music and Performing Arts in Vienna called Exilate.
Yes.
They do exactly what you're doing.
They've done a feature on that, yes, and of course we know them well, and we've got a very good working relationship with them. It's wow. So we were talking about this refugee experience as you just mentioned. That was really
I wonder what it has meant to you to be perceived as a refugee, to be perceived in Britain as a refugee.
Well, that's very interesting because. My father, for example, saw anti-Semitism crawling out of the woodwork everywhere. I remember once walking through the city with him, and we wanted to hail a taxi, and he hailed this taxi, and the taxi just drove past, and my father shouted, "Anti-Semite!" And the chances are that he was a Jew anyway, because so many taxi drivers were at that time. I have never experienced anti-Semitism, or at least I've not been conscious of it. As I say, when I was at school, I was bullied not for being a Jew, but for being a German. And it was quite difficult to explain, So, no, I don't think that I can't tell whether I would have done better in my career if I'd not been a refugee.
Right.
I can't do it. I can't do the control experiment, But I'm not conscious of having suffered from that. I think one of my advantages has been, because like I said earlier on, we always spoke German at home with my parents when I was living with my parents. So I learned good English, and I don't think people necessarily recognize me straight away as not being English by origin.
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Aside from people's perceptions of you, does it form any part of how you think about yourself?
I find that that was one of the questions that was on your list.
Yeah.
I've thought quite a bit about that. I don't know what I think of myself, actually. Yes, I think of myself as Jewish, and yet I've kept away from Jewish groups and societies and social activities and so on. Yes, when I was 13, I had to sing in synagogue at my bar mitzvah, and then there was a reception in London. My father managed to scrape enough money together. Weizmann was a guest at my bar mitzvah reception, who became president of Israel for a while. I can remember just wishing they'd get on with their bloody speeches because I wanted to eat some of the food that was available. And yet, I feel entirely Jewish, and yet I'm not part of the Jewish scene in any way. Both my wives are non-Jewish. My parents weren't happy about that. They never knew my second wife. They'd both been dead by then, but I think my father was rather keen on my first wife. She was very attractive, and that smoothed things a bit. But as I say, I've married non-Jewish women. Most of my friends aren't Jewish, and yet I do feel I'm Jewish. I don't feel Austrian, and yet culturally I'm very much, the music I love and have learned from and have performed have been Bach, yes, German, not Austrian, but Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven and Schubert and Schoenberg and Webern and so on. So it's very much a mixture, you know. I certainly feel British, and I'm quite involved in politics. You know, well, I used to canvass for the Labour Party when I was younger. You know, and I'm quite disturbed by what's been going on at the moment, as you can imagine. I'm pro staying as part of Europe, even despite the fact that Europe didn't do me that much of a favour originally. When I go to Austria, I've been quite a few times, I love the mountains. I feel quite happy in Innsbruck, which is where my father came from. I've been to Innsbruck 2 or 3 times. I climbed the Großglockner, the highest mountain in the Austrian Alps, you know. In Vienna, I feel uncomfortable all the time. I mean, Vienna is a wonderful city. I love the art galleries there, the architecture, the culture, obviously the music making. I went to the Staatsoper a few years ago when my wife and I went to Vienna. But I feel deeply uncomfortable in Vienna.
Why is that, do you think?
I've asked myself that over and over again because I was too young really to know what was going on. I knew obviously something was because we all left Vienna, and there was obviously an atmosphere of panic and fear and so on. I suppose a combination of somehow that acting on me, even though I didn't really know exactly what it was about, on the one hand, and on the other, becoming very conscious of what really was going on at a time when I became old enough to understand what was going on. And, so, you know, knowing about my uncle, for example, being killed in the Kristallnacht, but obviously knowing more about the Holocaust in general and so on. I mean, I've never, you know, if I met you in the street for the first time and you asked me what my background was, I would immediately, unhesitatingly say I was born in Austria, I'm Jewish, I was a refugee, I live in England, I feel very at home in England for all that I object to Boris, what's his name, and a few other people. So I'm quite happy about having that kind of background. I don't really feel that I belong anywhere very completely, and it doesn't worry me. I'm not, you know, it isn't that I feel desperate because I haven't got a home or a route or anything. I am what I am, and.
Well, the philosopher Wilhelm Flusser speaks about this.
Sorry?
The philosopher Wilhelm Flusser speaks about this and how he reflects on his own refugee experience and says that having had to live without those attachments that other people feel when they're settled, you know, and of course he had to sort of almost sever them when he left. He was from Prague. But he said,
was he
well, he was also a child, I think.
Was he? Yeah.
But he then says that as a migrant, he actually feels really free. He wrote this essay, The Freedom of the Migrant, because he feels he's free of these attachments and kind of could live almost anywhere, you know. And I think that's an interesting, you know, way of looking at this. And of course, he also adds to say that it's only for the people who were driven out to say that. I mean, you know, as a German. I mean, I'm also a migrant in some ways, but because I've been living here for 20 years, and I feel very excited and by the cross-cultural experience of my everyday life. You know, teaching British people about singing in German and about culture and all that. It is a never-ending, you know, conversation about cultural identity and expectations and images of another. And I suppose you've lived all your life in that, in that space between those cultures. And so has it been something that's has it been difficult at times? Also, this cross-cultural things, or would you say has it been more stimulating and exciting than difficult?
It's certainly, I think, fed into my life, and I don't know whether I'd say particularly use the word exciting, but it certainly fed into me and fertilized things. I mean, as I say, musically, I'm probably more Austrian than British. Mm-hmm. Culturally, otherwise, I'm probably more British than Austrian or Jewish, for that matter. Mm-hmm. I always think my father terribly missed the high mountains when I tried to persuade him that since most British mountains start practically at sea level, they're probably really almost as tall as the Austrian ones, but they haven't all got snow on and glaciers and so on. I love them. I love the scenery in Britain. I've done a lot of walking in the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District and so on. I feel very at home there. Swaledale particularly, because I used to to know the Keynes family quite well. They, not Maynard, but his brother, who was the great surgeon, but also the great Blake scholar, Sir Geoffrey. I knew his son and daughter-in-law and so on. And they have a house up in Swaledale, so my kids and I spent a great deal of holiday time up in Swaledale, I'm very at home there, actually more so than in the Austrian mountains, although I love them too, scenically, I'm very much, I think, I don't quite belong anywhere, but in another way I sort of belong everywhere, more or less, I mean, I've got connections with America. My first wife, who was the mother of my three children, is American, and I visited Virginia, which is where she came from, and she was cosmopolitan because her parents were from Virginia, but her father worked for one of the American banks abroad, so she was actually born in Bombay, and then went to school and lived a lot of the time in Bolivia. So we're all mongrels these days.
Yes.
Mongrels, that's good. Wow. Thank you. So, is there anything else we should talk about? Any other questions we want to ask?
I think that's great.
So, then...
Well, I must thank you for
thank you.
letting me go on and on.
That's been fascinating. Thank you so much, and thank you for contributing to the overall to our project with that very generous sharing of your memories.